Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much to Better Story for inviting me to come up. Thank you to you for coming. I'm aware that nowhere in London is close to wherever you start off. So most of you will have travelled, I think, a fair distance to be here. So I'm very grateful to you. Good. Well, let's begin with a couple of definitions, because the issue is that whenever we speak about this area, every term that we use is contested. And so the first thing we really need to do is to make some definitions so that you don't misunderstand me. For example, if I use the language of far right, you don't think that I'm saying you're far right if you voted for Brexit, for example. So because every single term that we use is contested, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to use terms today. So we're going to want to begin, if we just keep somebody on the slides for me. Thank you. That's great. I want to begin by just talking for a moment about liberal democracy, because I'm going to speak about things that undermine liberal democracy, and it's perhaps not a term that we all use all the time. We probably roughly know what democracy is. The elements that make a democracy a liberal democracy would include free and fair elections, the separation of legislative, so lawmaking, judicial, and executive. That means kind of police powers. Independence of the press, protection of minorities. Otherwise, you get what's known as the tyranny of the majority, where a majority of people vote the government in and they act in a kind of totalitarian way, and everybody who didn't happen to vote that way loses their rights. And freedom of speech. So I'm not a political theologian, or I'm certainly not a political specialist, but I think that'll do as a kind of reasonable discussion of what liberal democracy means. So when I use the term, you'll know what I'm referring to. Right, let's go on to define the term far right. So here I'm leaning on the work of probably the leading expert in the world on far right movements, a man called Kaz Mudder. And he defines the far right in a way that I think is quite helpful, because it's relatively objective. And it takes us away from that kind of that tendency to use these terms as slurs, as like, you're far right if I just disagree with you, and you're further right than me on the political spectrum. So he defines far right as movements which are a threat to liberal democracy, which is why I defined that term at the beginning. And he then divides those movements into two. So there is the extreme right, and the extreme right are movements which are opposed to, which are seeking to dismantle democracy, full stop. So that would traditionally you'd think of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler as examples of that. Now we are seeing such movements in Britain. By their very nature, they are underground. Because such movements would be proscribed. But they do exist in very small numbers, thankfully in very small numbers. But I've got a friend who works as an expert witness in some of the trials of these individuals. And he says that some of the stories that he has to plough through in preparation to give evidence are absolutely hair-raising, and that the perpetrators are getting younger and younger and younger. So we might just hold that thought, actually. So that's the extreme right, but the radical right is that section of the blanket term far right, who are not seeking to dismantle democracy, but are acting in a way which poses a threat to liberal democracy, to those elements that I just defined on the previous slide. So if I use that term, far right, that's what I mean by it. Okay. Only one more definition, and it's the one that really was on the title of the reason that you came, I guess, which is Christian nationalism. Now, this also is a term that is used by various people in various ways, and there are certainly Christians, some very prominent Christians, who say, I'm a Christian, I'm a nationalist, by which they probably mean I'm a patriot, therefore I'm a Christian nationalist, and what's wrong with that? And here we see the issue of definitions and how tricky this is. The Christian nationalism that I'm talking about today is a Christian nationalism which I believe is probably a much more muscular defense of our Christian heritage. Now, around about the same time, 2014 and 2015, we've got a group called Britain First. It still exists, actually, but it was quite active in those mid-years of the previous decade. And next slide, please. So they conducted a number of operations under what they called crusades. And of course, the intentional choice of such a word is really troubling. And two of their crusades would include, one of them on the left-hand side of the slide, would be parading through Muslim-majority cities with these big white crosses, aggressively shouting things like, "Muslims go home, this is a Christian country, you're not welcome here," such things. Those two individuals that you can see there subsequently both served time in prison for racially aggravated hate crime or something in that ballpark. Around about the same time, the same organization conducted invasions into at least 2 mosques during the time of prayer with Bibles and leaflets, again, calling this a crusade. So that's the middle of the last decade. If we skip on a little bit, one of the organizations which plots these movements quite carefully is called Hope Not Hate. And every year they publish a report of what they've seen the previous year, which they call the State of Hate. And the State of Hate 2024, which is therefore reporting on 2023, plotted the fact that these movements were gaining traction significantly. And a quotation from that report on the slide behind me. The radical right is blossoming. Again, you can see how these terms are being used differently, but I think what they're saying, radical right, is what we would have called the far right by the definition I just used. The radical right is blossoming. 2023 is the year it came of age. And we will all remember, 2023 isn't that long ago, but actually things have moved on substantially since then, I suspect you all know. Now, I live in Bristol, and I want to tell you a very short story from Ramadan 2024. On the next slide, please. So every year for the last few years, Bristol Cathedral has opened its precincts to local Muslims and other people from the community who would like to join with them to have a grand iftar during Ramadan. Now, the thing about a grand iftar is it's a meal, no prayers are involved. And in 2024, they did this as they had for the last few years. The plan was initially that they would meet on College Green, which is just outside the cathedral. It started raining, as tends to happen in Bristol, and they were then invited into the cathedral. I wasn't present, but I've scrutinized images and video of the event, and there was no act of worship. There was no Muslim act of worship. There was no Christian act of worship. It was just people eating together. A prominent individual took to his keyboard in response to seeing images of this and said that this is evidence that we are living in the, quote, Islamic Caliphate of Great Britain. And this was on X, and because he has quite a substantial following on X, a lot of comments then unfolded over the next couple of days. And here are some select excerpts from the comments on that Twitter thread. "We need to defend our land. We have been conquered." I want you just to notice the use of we and they and who it includes and who it excludes. We have been conquered. They took over Hagia Sophia in, doesn't matter how many times I say this, I can't remember the date, 1453. Now they've seized the UK without firing a shot. Exorcised the cathedral. And perhaps most troublingly of all, we need a new crusade. So that's April 2024. Move on just a few months to July 2024. Next slide, please. And as you may remember, Tommy Robinson held a large rally in Trafalgar Square. Now, I want to say something just general about this rally and the Unite the Kingdom one, which is on the next slide, which is that people turn out to these events for a whole load of reasons. And I have no interest at all in vilifying people who show up to those events, but I am very interested in who gets handed the microphone. You can't control who turns up to an event. You can control who you give the microphone to. And so that's what I'm going to focus on, is what was platformed. So July 2024, it happened to be the day after the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Paris. And you might remember that that was particularly controversial. And that I mentioned that because it got picked up in at least one of the speeches. So a number of speakers were platformed, including on the right-hand side of the slide, a man called Ricky Doolan, who had a kind of gospel choir. As you can see, he's wearing a Union Jack jacket, flanked by a flag that says Christ is King. And he and his gospel choir played a number of songs, including some worship songs and including Jerusalem. So can you see we're getting a conflation now of kind of patriotic symbolism and Christian faith symbolism. And then we have this man called Kai Dua, who is a bishop in a splinter denomination. And he gave a 6-minute speech, which I have watched so many times I could quote it by heart, but I won't. I'll just give you some select excerpts. He took the opportunity to speak in really unpleasant othering terms about the French because of what had happened the previous night. He then said, quote, "We are not at war with just the Muslim." And a little bit later on, he said, "I will fight for this cause and the gospel of Jesus Christ. This nation of ours is under attack." Now listen to this. "Today, when I look out across this square, I don't pray for revival in the land, because today, standing in Trafalgar Square, I can see in thousands of faces that revival has already begun." So this man, this Christian, is looking out at a political rally and saying, "I see Christian revival." So as I've been watching this, I would have used the language of the far right, probably until about that moment. But at that moment, really, this movement has now crossed over into what I would call Christian nationalism by the definition that I just offered you. Skip on another year, and you will probably remember that in September 2025, Tommy Robinson held a very large rally and march called Unite the Kingdom Rally, probably about 150,000 people there. We've already mentioned it today. Again, who was platformed? Well, some of the same individuals were platformed. But of particular interest is this man called Brian Tamaki, who came over from New Zealand with a hacker troupe who performed really quite a prolonged hacker. And then and at the end, kind of very performatively tore up a number of flags. And then he gave a short speech at which he called for the forcible ban of all religions except Christianity from the UK. He said, "We are in the context of a religious war of Christianity versus the rest, and we need to, quote, clean our countries up by, quote, getting out everything that does not receive Jesus Christ." Now, it wouldn't be fair to stop there without commenting briefly on the carol service which Tommy Robinson held last month, and which I actually attended. And I'm not the only person, there's some other people in the audience who attended it as well. So in December 2025, Tommy Robinson put on a carol service which was going to, quote, put Christ back into Christmas, unquote. And he promised that it would be a Christian worship service and that there would be no politics. And I and a lot of other people went, "Oh yeah, we'll see, won't we?" And I have to say, I stand corrected. He pretty much did what he promised. So in the crowd, I would say 3 different categories of people, clearly overlapping categories, but there were observers like myself who wouldn't have been there except wanted to see what was going on. There were people who were there out of Christian observance and wanted to worship and wanted to, were there clearly worshipping. And then there were people who were there under what I would call the patriot banner. And you could tell, I'm not saying some of those weren't Christians, but you could tell that what reason they'd come for because of what they were carrying or perhaps the tattoos they wore and so on. And the crowd was mainly, but by no means exclusively, white, and there was a significant proportion of working class in the crowd. About 1,000, probably 50, 1 to 1,500, something like that. So not a particularly big event. And what happened was a whole lot of scripture, far more scripture than a typical Baptist service on a Sunday morning, I have to say. Lots of carols, prayers, and a whole succession of Christian leaders and 1 or 2 others, perhaps 1 or 2 influencers, who each gave a very short mini sermon and a gospel call. There was no politics, apart from the fact that 1 or 2 of them referred to the crowd as patriots. Patriots, we're here to worship Christ, sort of thing. Apart from that, really, that was really the only kind of political nod that was visible. And I have to say that Tommy Robinson didn't present himself until about 1 hour and 3/4, right at the very end. In fact, we'd had a final blessing, and I think many people wondered if he was even going to show up at all. And he gave a very short, but really quite an impassioned speech, which again did not refer to politics, but referred to his faith, his faith, which he said he'd come to faith in prison, and spoke quite passionately about it. So you know, we await the fruit. I have to believe that if the Spirit of God can meet Saul and stop him in his tracks, then he can meet Tommy Robinson. But we have to await the fruit and see. And I have to say, I'm now subscribed to his emails, and what's coming out is not particularly encouraging. But if he is a baby, if he is a Christian believer, he needs to do what Paul did, actually, and take himself off for 3 years and be discipled properly. And then maybe he's got something to say to us. How are we doing for time? Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview. I know you've come to hear theology today, but I need to set the scene a little bit so that we kind of all know what we're talking about. We're on the same page. Let me offer you a few more thoughts, and then we're going to take a little break, and I'll give you a chance to kind of chat to your neighbours for a few minutes. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to offer you a model, which I'm going to come back to a couple of times in our time together. And I want to suggest that any of the divisive issues which are polarizing us today, and you'll know what they are, we'll perhaps come to them in a few minutes, but any of the divisive issues in our society today, people's opinions will vary, of course, that's the whole point of the fact that they're divisive. But that I think we would have to agree that within a liberal democracy, not everybody has to entirely agree with everybody else. In fact, if we all had exactly the same opinion on, let's say, immigration, then quite honestly, we probably wouldn't be in liberal democracy. We'd probably be in somewhere like North Korea, where everybody apparently has exactly the same opinion. So we have to say that there has to be scope for a range of opinions. But I think we would also want to say that there are opinions or kind of arguments being made which would lie beyond what we would consider acceptable within a liberal democracy. So what I've got up there is not in any way trying to say where the boundaries lie, because apart from anything else, I haven't even put an issue up on there. But to offer you a model of how we might think about how opinions would vary on any particular matter. And so you can see we've got 4 individuals. If you look at the 2 within these, so the purple ellipse, it defines what we might notionally say are the boundaries of liberal democracy. And so you've got somebody who is on the right-hand side of that ellipse and somebody who is on the left-hand side of that ellipse. And I want to say that if they fall within liberal democracy, then I'm going to call them moderates. Okay, I've got the microphone, so I can call them what I like. So I'm going to call them moderates. Okay. And then I want to say that the people who fall beyond that purple ellipse, I'm going to say are extreme, just for the sake of some terminology to use. Okay, is this making sense so far? So let's think about this in the situation of the highly polarizing issue of whether we put jam or cream first on our scones. Oh, scones, another polarizing issue. See, I told you can't speak about this without getting yourself in hot water. Okay, so what would fall within the bounds of liberal democracy within this particular issue? Well, I want to suggest that putting jam first and then cream on top probably falls within what we would consider acceptable within a liberal democracy. And I want to suggest that even if we don't agree, putting cream first and then jam probably also falls within what we might accept as a liberal democracy. And I mean, there might be some crazy people who don't like cream or don't like jam and only want one of them or want butter or something. And then we can probably accommodate them within that ellipse as well, just about, okay. What might fall beyond that then? Well, I did this experiment with a group earlier in the week, and we had a bit longer, so I got them to feed back, and I had various extreme suggestions, including execution. I'll just go with imprisonment without trial for people who want to put cream on first, or imprisonment without trial for those who want to put jam on first. I think we would say that such a proposal would fall beyond the bounds of liberal democracy. What I want you to notice, though, is that if we look at, say, I'm trying to get my lefts and rights lined up for you. If we look at, let's say, the right side, that the moderates and the extreme, they share the same ideology. They both say jam first. Is that right? Cream first. But the extremes have taken that same ideology and made it divisive and violent. But they share the same ideology. And then, of course, the same thing on the other side. They share the same ideology, but the extremes have taken that ideology, that moderate ideology, and are wanting to express it in a way which is divisive and violent. Does that make sense? I want us to understand this because I'm going to build on it in a couple of times over the remaining of our time together. I'll come back to it once or twice. In fact, I'll come back to it straight away with the next slide, please. So what I'm seeing at the moment, a lot of, I'll be interested to know whether you think you're seeing this as well. I'm seeing people, if we move away from scones for a minute, I'm seeing people who have what I would consider, whether I agree with their opinion or not, what I would consider moderate opinions about, let's say, immigration, on both sides of the spectrum, who are calling each other extreme right or extreme left. But actually, I think that if we listen to their opinion, I would personally put it within the purple ellipse. Now, how is that happening? Well, I think what's happening is that they're listening to their own extremes, and their own extreme wing is saying to them, those moderates, except they're not using that language, those moderates are extreme. And then the same thing is happening on the other side. And so the moderates are being fed a narrative by the more extreme versions of their own ideology. And they are being schooled to see the other moderates as extremists. And of course, if I turn to somebody and I shout at them for being far left or far right, are they going to move warmly towards me and wish to dialogue with me, embrace me in brotherly love? No, they're not. They're going to move further away from me. And then if they shout at me and call me extreme, whatever, I'm going to move further away from them. So it is the extremes who are fueling this polarization by schooling their own moderates to view the others as extreme. Does that make sense? Okay, so I think I'm going to put up a slightly detailed slide in a moment. I'm going to just kind of run through, I think, some of the right-leaning ideologies that some of these groups have. But I want you already now, just before we go on to that one, please. I want you already now to remember that we have said that groups can share the ideology, and it's not necessarily the content of what they believe. It might be the extent to which they wish to enforce it, or the intensity with which they hold it, or whatever. I mean, there are some opinions that I think we would consider by their very nature would fall beyond the ellipse. But I want us to realize that this ideology, this same ideology, can kind of smudge itself across a whole range. So in a moment, when I put this slide up, I'm going to go through on the left-hand side of the slide the general ideologies that these Christian nationalist groups tend to share, and this is not uniform, so you may struggle to find somebody who ticks every single one of those boxes. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, we'll look at how they might express themselves in problematic, divisive, and violent ways. Is that what we're looking at before we look at it? Okay, I'm going to need to turn a little bit now because there's a lot of detail in this slide, forgive me. Okay, thank you. So if I just read down this, and I don't pretend this is a complete list, but it's kind of indicative, perhaps. So concern around immigration and desire for tighter border control. Not, I think, inherently divisive and violent. Concern around the growth of or influence of Islam. Sense of Christian marginalization or persecution. Patriotism and concern about loss of English or British identity. Concern for our armed forces and veterans. Conservative stances on issues of human sexuality and gender identity. Probably this one more in the States, but preference of individual freedom over group responsibility. Desire to recover a Christian nation. And various conspiracisms. And I want to say that conspiracisms are not confined to the right side of the ideological spectrum, but that's the one we're looking at today. So that's a reasonably representative list, I think, of the ideologies that we're talking about. And I want to again say that whatever our own perspectives on these matters, most of those, I think, can find a moderate expression that sits within that liberal democracy ellipse. Okay, so what might they look like in their more extreme versions on the right-hand side? Again, not pretending this is a complete list, but punitive and hostile attitudes to immigrants of any cause. And Fergus gave us a quotation, which I hadn't particularly heard that one actually, a particularly shocking one earlier. Resistance to religious tolerance, such as the call to shut down the expression of all faiths except the Christian faith in this country. Hate speech or violence towards people who aren't straight and cis. Covert or overt racism. Attempt to suppress freedom of speech. Again, this is not limited to those on the right. A conflation of Christianity with English or Britishness, and a conflation of Christianity with whiteness. A suppression of freedom of religion and anti-Muslim rhetoric, and promotion of conspiracies. Again, that's not necessarily confined to those on the right. So from those ideologies, what I'd like to think about for a minute now is why are they appealing to, let's say, the white disadvantaged? Now, let me say right now that these movements have appeal across wide sections of society, by no means just white people, by no means just disadvantaged people, and there is some really big money funding these movements, and that certainly isn't coming from the Council of States. So I'm not interested in vilifying anybody, and I hope I've said that once, and I will keep repeating that because I really want that clear. But nonetheless, there is a substantial appeal that these movements make to white disadvantage. It is worth reflecting on what is the attraction. And again, you know, everything I'm saying here, we could spend an hour discussing and nuancing. So forgive me where perhaps it doesn't have quite as much nuance as I'd have liked. But we have the next slide. Thank you. So generational unemployment, substandard housing, poor infrastructure. You have to, you know, you can't get a bus across town to where the jobs are. No one in your family's had a job for 50 years. You're living in substandard accommodation, and you can't get the landlord to fix your damp problem or whatever. And then somebody tells you it's all the fault of those immigrants. The sense of disenfranchisement, the sense of being left behind and disregarded and just not really mattering. And that was something that was repeated several times from the platform, actually, at the Tommy Robinson Carol service. And it was kind of heartbreaking. Tommy Robinson himself said, the church didn't want us, referring back to his early days in Luton. Now, you know, that's a particular narrative and so on, but it felt quite painful. There is, among some of these, and among some young people as well, a snapback against what they perceive to be a shrill and patronising woke movement, which kind of rebukes people if they don't get it right, in inverted commas. A feeling, a narrative that the most disadvantaged people in British society today are white working class men, which is probably not wholly true, but probably not wholly untrue either, I would suggest. And again, along the lines of, if I shout at you for your opinion or your actions, you're not going to move towards me warmly. Being criticised as racist for flying the George Cross. People put the flags up for a whole load of reasons, very, very complex. And I think our responses need to be compassionate and complex as well. So some thoughts about why these movements can have appeal among certain demographics. Now let's think about why they can be appealing to Christians, understanding, of course, that those two groups can also overlap. But I think what makes these groups appealing to Christians, or to certain Christians, tends to be a different set of priorities. So there is indisputably a loss of Christian visibility in society. If you look at the stats from the last 3 censuses, the number of people who claimed an allegiance to Christianity in 2001 plummeted to 2011 and fell again 10 years later. Now, of course, we can talk about what that represents, and the stats aren't the full picture, but the stats exist. On the other hand, Islam more than doubled between 2001 and 2021. The figures are very, very different. Figures are still a very long way apart, but the trajectories are moving in a particular direction. And for some, that is a real concern. Some of the things that are going through Parliament at the present, or have been going through recently, around beginning and end of life trends, law changes around same-sex marriage and trans issues, trouble some Christians greatly. And we should notice then that while, of course, there are absolutely Christians among the white disadvantaged, so I'm not for a moment suggesting these are separate groups, but there are kind of a separate set of impulses that perhaps make these movements feel attractive. Now, I want to offer you my best analysis right now, but it is a moving field, and so I keep tweaking this diagram. But my best analysis right now of how I think Christian nationalism is gaining traction and what the kind of energizing forces are. Thank you. So I think we've got two groups. We've got some political actors, and again, I'm not saying that they can't be Christians, of course, and we've got some influential Christians. And these two groups, I think, see in each other something that they can exploit to their own advantage. Perhaps exploit isn't always too unkind a word, but perhaps it doesn't have to be exploit. Something that they can use to their own advantage. And these two groups then kind of mutually co-opt each other and create a kind of cynical alliance. So for the political actors, I think they see in the church something that gives them credibility. I called it church washing recently, something that gives them plausibility and perhaps allows them to extend their, to grow their kind of constituency, as it were, that they're following. On the other side of the diagram, you've got certain influential Christians, like perhaps the ones who I quoted a few minutes ago, who see in these political movements the opportunity to grow in power or influence. Now, again, we can discuss and think about whether that is a cynical desire for personal enrichment or whether that is a more laudable desire to see the church grow in influence. But I think that they see in it something that will allow them to gain traction in terms of power and influence. So you've got these two groups which then form this cynical mutual co-option. And then they generate, and this is the quotation from my Christian nationalism definition, and they generate a collection of myths and traditions and symbols and narratives and value systems. And can you just even in your mind's eye see that collection of myths and symbols and value systems and traditions that is being promoted at the moment? And then they effectively sell that to the population. They sell that to the wider public. And in that process, they both generate and weaponize or exploit fear, and they exploit feelings of hopelessness and financial precarity and anxiety and concern around loss of identity and concern around rapid social change and all the sorts of things that we have just named. They use this narrative they have constructed, they exploit those things, and they then, as it were, sell this myth to susceptible portions of the general public. And when we are talking about this co-option of the Christian narrative with political action, then the people who are susceptible are believing Christians and cultural Christians. And cultural Christians is not a term I defined, but you probably know what I mean. It's people who like the outward form. Richard Dawkins describes himself as a cultural Christian, and he's an atheist. Somebody who likes the outward form but doesn't have the commitment to Jesus Christ. So that's my best analysis of what's going on right now. And I want to remind you of the story of Faust. It's a made-up story, as I'm sure you know. But Faust was a character who sold his soul to the devil in order to gain power and money. And I want to just read you this quotation. So Occidental Descent is a particularly nasty alt-right group from the States. So it's not in our country, but I want you to listen to what he says because I think it's very significant. This is a few years ago now. He leads Occidental Descent, or did at the time. He says, the alt-right shouldn't get hung up on being anti-Christian because Christianity is infinitely malleable. After we seize power and get on television, the alt-right will be celebrated as Christian. That's quite troubling, isn't it? And I have to say, he's being proved right, I think. So that's a little bit of an analysis of what's going on. I wanted to go a bit more deeply now, because I want to suggest that one of the things we are seeing in many, not all of the individuals in these movements, but in many of the individuals in these movements, is what I would call a thin theology. And when I say a thin theology, I mean the use of slogans or images with very little content or substance beneath them. Now, again, remember what I've said, that I am not interested in vilifying people who turned up to the Unite the Kingdom rally with a Christ is King banner. They came for a whole load of reasons, and many of them are my Christian brothers and sisters, okay? But the use of such banners by those who are leading such movements can be a thin appeal to make a set of political claims that actually has very little to do with the lordship of Christ, has very little to do with the servant king, very little to do with the master who washed his disciples' feet. But it's a good slogan. That's what I mean by thin theology. The parading of the cross through Muslim majority areas as a reason, as a pretext to shout, Muslims, go home, this is a Christian country, you're not welcome here, is a thin theology because it seems to have no connection with the master who died for the life of the world, with the one who said, take up your cross daily and follow me. So that's what I mean by thin theology. And one of the things that I would love us to think about, perhaps to take home and to take up as a challenge, is that we who are in church leadership particularly, but all of us, we need to learn to and help others to learn to smell a rat. Because the thing is that when somebody walks through the streets carrying a Christ is King banner, it's really, really hard to articulate why that might be problematic without sounding like you don't believe Christ is King. And I absolutely, for the avoidance of doubt, believe Christ is King. I also believe that we should be free to and bold enough to proclaim that. So why is it a problem when people are using that? Can you see it's tricky, but if we can help our congregations to understand, to notice, to go slightly below the surface, not simply to take the slogan, but to think, what's this slogan? What work is this doing? What cause is it promoting? So that's a challenge that I am trying to take seriously, and I would invite you to think about. However, not everybody who is operating in this sphere is working with thin theology. There are thick theologies, there are well-developed theologies of Christian nationalism, which I disagree with, but you can't say they're thin. So just pulling out three, probably the three key ones. Thank you. So first of all, there's something called dominionism. And this pops up in all sorts of different ways. So there was a very influential book published in the American setting about 3 or 4 years ago called The Case for Christian Nationalism. And he argues, very badly, I have to say, as a biblical scholar and particular interest in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, he argues very badly from Genesis 1, 2, and 3, but he does use God's command to Adam and Eve, and by the way, it's to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, in Genesis 1, to have dominion, and he uses an argument there that ends up with only Christian men should rule, and only Christian men should vote. Yeah, I don't commend the book. You can't say it's not a thick. It's carefully argued. It's very badly mistaken, in my opinion. And if you want me to tell you why, I'll give you half an hour afterwards. But in a nutshell, first of all, that command is given to male and female, very explicitly male and female, and in the context of that very ancient world in which that text emerged, that is astonishing. And secondly, it is not the image of God. So he argues that the image of God is lost at the fall, and that is explicitly wrong as well, because the image of God is very clearly present in the account that follows the fall. But he argues that the image of God is lost at the fall, and therefore it is at salvation that the imagehood is restored, and therefore the command to have dominion kind of comes along with that. That's the narrative. But he's using Genesis very badly indeed, I have to say. So that's one element of dominionism. But can you hear that will to power, that sense that Christians ought to be on the top? And it can be articulated in a very kind of benevolent sort of way. We ought to be on the top because we know what's best for everybody. So it isn't necessarily articulated in a kind of cynical way. A second thick theology is that of the need to restore a Christian Britain. And this is, I'm increasingly hearing this being articulated around King Alfred, and about how King Alfred, when he united the various tribes, did it as an explicitly Christian nation. I'm not a historian, that may or may not be the case. I suspect it's correct, but I don't understand why that would have a defining control over how we view ourselves today. There's a lot of interesting moments in British history which we may or may not like, which we could equally point to say, well, why don't we let that one define us or this one define us? So restoring a Christian Britain. And of course, if we do want to look at that, we do need to interrogate some of the things that Christian Britain got up to. A third theology, a third thick theology of Christian nationalism, which kind of relates to the previous one, looks at the church's historic role in establishing Britain's culture of tolerance. Now, I have to say that I don't dispute that. I think that is true. I think we are where we are today because of the effect of the gospel. And we look at both the explicit action of Christians, like, for example, the Clapham sect, working to reform prisons and working to abolish slavery and so on, but also the implicit, the way that Christianity shaped the thought world of this country for hundreds of years. I wouldn't dispute that for a moment. But to take that then and make an argument about what that should mean for, in particular, the established church, which in our country is the Church of England, personally, I don't follow it there. So I've just this week been rereading Danny Kruger's speech, which he gave in the House of Parliament last year. And it's very interesting. And again, there are things that I really agree with, particularly around the first half of that sentence there. But then where he takes this and the conclusions he draws, personally, I would not agree with. And some of that is because I'm a Baptist, not a member of the Church of England, but some of that I think is because, in my opinion, that is theologically mistaken, irrespective of our perspective on the established church. So let me offer some theological reflections on what's going on. And if I just skip on to the next slide, please. I suggest that we need a lot of theological reflection on this present moment. And there are lots of elements and lots of facets that need us to reflect. And it's worth just looking for a moment at the prism, the range of things that we need to reflect on really carefully and thoughtfully. So absolutely, we need to think theologically about the theologies themselves. For example, about the ideologies themselves. We need to do some theological thinking about migration, for example. I don't think that's going to lead us to a single opinion, but it's a subject that we should be, as church, thinking theologically about. And all of the other ideologies. We should also, in my opinion, be thinking theologically about the polarization of our society, which is a kind of, it's a separate, it's not a detached issue, but it's a different issue. We ought to be reflecting about the extent to which the church ought to be and how the church ought to be involved in the political realm. And opinions will vary on that matter, but we need to think about it theologically. It's also worth thinking theologically about this present cultural moment and what that means for mission. Does it represent a threat to the church's mission? Does it represent an opportunity for the church's mission? Or is it something more sophisticated than either of those? We might also want to think about the pastoral implications of the current moment. And I want to, for a moment, promote the idea of the church as, among other things, as pastor to the culture. What are the deep pains and deep wounds that this current moment is laying bare to us? And how might the church respond pastorally to those? And I think also there is a challenge around the character, one might even say the soul of the church right now. And we need to think theologically about that. And if we respond to any of these things just out of a kind of knee-jerk, well, obviously it's this or obviously it's that, we are likely to end up, we might end up in places that actually thoughtful, prayerful, theological engagement would suggest are a little bit thin. We are in danger of responding to thin ideology, or thin theology rather, with thin theology. And I want to commend that we don't do that, but that we pause and we think richly and deeply. Now, I can't help you to think richly and deeply in the remaining kind of 10 minutes or so that I've got to speak. But I want to kind of drop a few thoughts which you might then go away and ruminate on a little bit more. So next slide, please. Yes, that one, thank you. So I'd like us to think for a minute about the temptation of Jesus. It's a story that I come back to again and again and again. And if I actually work in reverse order through his temptations, and because I've got more to say about the first one. So the third temptation is the temptation that, Satan sets him on a high mountain, spreads out all the nations before him and says, you can have them all, just bow down and worship me. All of these temptations are a temptation to build the kingdom of God the quick way, the easy way. And that third one, the temptation to power, the temptation to seek power rather than to take the long, hard, painful, obedient road of the cross. It's the temptation of power and the temptation of idolatry. The second one, throw yourself down off the temple and the angels will scoop you up and everybody will go, wow, and then you'll get an instant following. It's the temptation to spectacle over substance. Now, the first one is a little bit more, well, they're all interesting, actually. You could have a whole preaching series on those temptations. They are so rich and they repay deep reflection. So I'm not doing them justice, really, but needs must. But the first one is particularly interesting because the first one, turn these stones into bread, is a temptation that comes back in Jesus' ministry. And we see that when he has fed 5,000 people in the desert. Because there were many attempted rebellions at the time of Jesus. Many people who wanted to throw off the Roman yoke. And the way you do it is you go out into the desert and you assemble your army, and then in you come, and with a bit of luck, you might get rid of the Romans, of course, except it never happened. But that's how you do it. So when Jesus goes out into the wilderness and he ends up feeding 5,000 men, it is interesting that it's men. Let's not immediately go, oh, they only care about men. In this context, this story is crackling with political possibility. And he feeds 5,000 men, and then they want to make him king by force. John's Gospel. He's just fed them, and they want to make him king. Why? Because they can read what's going on. They know how this plays out. You raise your army, and in you come. And there is the same temptation playing out in kind of practice from how it was envisaged in theory at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And it is the temptation to popularity, and one might even say, an anachronistic term, but the temptation to populism, one might even say. That these movements promote power. They want to build the kingdom of God, and they want to build it with power and quickly. And that is not how the kingdom of God grows. And of course, we see that Jesus resisted those temptations, both in the desert and when the crowd wanted to make him king by force. Next slide, please. I'd like to suggest, though, that those temptations apply to us on whichever side of the political spectrum we sit. So for those who are on the right side of the political spectrum, the attraction of political power, we've already spoken about it, we can see that perhaps. The temptation of spectacle over substance, of image over substance, we might map to the temptation to cultural Christianity without deep underlying discipleship. The temptation to power and idolatry, we can see being played out in the political idolatry of some of these movements, where people put faith in the leader, and oh my word, are we seeing that in the States right now. But there's a danger always in our own country as well. If not faith in a particular leader, certainly faith in a movement. But those temptations are also playing out on the left, because the temptation of popularity and populism plays out, I think, with the really toxic power of shaming. It's really hard to say, I was wrong right now. Because and especially for people who have built their platform one way or another on a particular issue, it's really hard to say I was wrong, because as soon as you do, people call you out and shame you for having been wrong rather than welcoming. We see it in politics, don't we? We see it, Party A says to Party B, you need to adopt this policy, adopt this policy, adopt this policy. They adopt the policy and they go, you turn. But actually we do this all the time in our social media platforms. So the power of shaming. spectacle over substance, or appearance over substance. I would suggest the tendency to the social justice fruits without the Christian roots is a real temptation. Power and idolatry. Do you know what? It's exactly the same on the left as on the right. Faith in the leader or faith in the movement. There is one name in heaven and earth by which we may be saved, and it is Jesus Christ. It is not a political party. It is not a political movement. It is not an ideology. And when we fail to notice that, we fail that third temptation, which Jesus didn't fail. Okay, I'll step down from preaching mode again. Sorry about that. Next slide, please. How am I doing for time? Daniel 7 is possibly one of my top 2 or 3 chapters in the Old Testament. It would be one that I would take to a desert island with me. It's one that is poorly known in the churches, actually, especially the first part of it. So Daniel, we like the book of Daniel, don't we? Because it's got exciting things going on. Then we get to Daniel 7, it all gets a bit weird, and we're probably inclined to turn the page. Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts coming out of the sea. And my word, these beasts are hideous. None of them looks like anything that you're going to see if you go and visit a zoo. They're all like some sort of Frankenstein's monster, some sort of kind of hideous mishmash of teeth and claws and wings. And these beasts, well, we're told later on in the chapter that they represent great world rulers. And to some extent, it doesn't really matter to us. They probably represent, let me get this right, Babylon, Persia, Greece and Rome. That's probably the 4 that Daniel has in mind. But what they are saying to us is something about all empires. So these beasts, they are hideous, but more than that, they pretend to be human. One of them gets kind of propped up on its back feet, and it kind of stands there talking like a human. Another one is described as having dominion. Oh, there's that word again. Dominion is that blessing and charge which God has given to only humans. So the first half of Daniel 7 is actually a really powerful political critique. And it is saying all human power ultimately tends to be bestial. All human power needs to be restrained and controlled and held to account. And don't put your trust in anyone, in any one of them. Then we open the second part of the chapter, and this is part you'll probably know a bit better, because thrones are set up in heaven. Oh, and the Ancient of Days comes and takes his throne, but there were thrones multiple set up in heaven. And then comes forward one like a son of man. And in Daniel's day, that simply means a human. But of course, we recognize that language because Jesus refers to himself all the time as Son of Man, because he's referring to Daniel 7. And so here we see a human who comes into heaven with the Ancient of Days and takes a throne beside the Ancient of Days, and all dominion, there's that word again, is given to him. And so Daniel 7 is crackling with, it's crackling with wonder, quite honestly. It says to us, there is only one worthy of worship. There is only one who can properly exercise dominion in a way that is fully human, because there has only been one perfect human, and all human power ultimately will tend to the bestial. And it is a very potent reminder to us not to put our faith in charismatic leaders and charismatic movements. Next slide, please. We are being sold a false dichotomy by certain movements right now, I think. And the dichotomy is that either the state must be run by the church in one way or another. This is effectively dominionism in a expressed a different way. Either the state must be run by the church, or faith will become completely privatized, and we will lose any ability to speak the name of Jesus in the public square. And I think that is a lie. Those are not the only 2 options available to us. A third way is to understand the church as having a prophetic role. And you probably know, but I'll remind you that the key thing about prophecy in the Old Testament is not foreseeing, but forthtelling. It is speaking truth to power. That's why the prophets were always getting themselves in trouble, because as one king of Israel said when they sent for a prophet, I hate him because he never says anything good about me, only bad stuff. Rare moment of honesty from the king at that point. This is the role of the prophet, and the prophet operates better from the margins. In that same story, the prophet has to be sent for. There's 400 court prophets who are in the pay of the king, and they're right there on the spot, and they're telling the king exactly what he wants to hear, but they have to send for Micaiah because he's not in the pay of the king. This, in my view, is the role of an important part of the role of the church in the day. We need no one's permission to be prophetic. We certainly don't need privilege or influence to be prophetic, but I think it is a core part of the calling of the church. Next slide, please. I've already referred to this once. I probably won't labour. I suspect. I saw nods, so I think you will probably know this. The parables of the kingdom, which Jesus told, are really worth meditating on, and they have a lot to say to the present movements, which have this will, as we've said, this will to power, this will to bring the kingdom of God by power and force. Jesus says the kingdom of God grows like a mustard seed, grows like yeast. Those have been favourites of mine for a long while, but more recently I've been thinking about his slightly less well-known one, parable of the seed in the field. The farmer plants the seed and then basically goes home and puts his feet up and watches TV. I mean, that's a slightly modernised version of it, but the seed continues to grow because it's not actually dependent on the farmer, because it is the Lord who sends the rain and the sun and causes growth. And this is the wonder of how the kingdom of God grows, so often in spite of people like me, rather than because of us. Next one, please. I think one of the feelings that it related to my previous point, I think, one of the feelings is we need to effectively put Christ on the throne. We need to assert his kingship because people don't acknowledge it. We need to enthrone Christ. And I would dare to suggest that Christ is already on the throne and he doesn't actually need a helping shove from us. And Christ is on the throne, and so we don't need to make dodgy political deals to put him there. There is a sort of utilitarianism about parts of this movement, by which I mean the end justifies the means. If we can get Christian influence, if we can make the church more successful and prominent and visible, it doesn't matter how we get there, it doesn't matter who we make alliances with, it doesn't matter what lies we tell along the way, or whatever it is, there is that utilitarianism. And I would suggest that the character of the people of God should be of more interest to us than where we think we ought to be heading. It's one of the things I bang on to my students about a lot. As I'm responsible I help to shape new Baptist ministers, and I talk to them a lot about, you might think you know where God's leading this church, but if you don't do it in a Christ-like way, then you are really failing your church. And I think that maps to the larger political scene as well. I've also been reflecting quite a lot recently about what it means to remove the plank from my own eye, and all of us to remove the plank from our own eye. And I'm going to return us back to that spectrum that I showed you earlier. Now, remembering what he said, that the moderates and their own extremes broadly share the same ideology at both, and the same thing on the other end, okay? So what would it mean as me, as a notional moderate on one side or other of the political spectrum, to attend to the plank in my own eye? I think what it means is I turn to those who are more extreme than me, and I say, how dare you take my good and moderate and reasonable opinions and make them something divisive and hateful? And I will not defend you for that. But actually what people are doing quite a lot of is saying, well, they've got a point. And of course, same thing happening on the other side. So I think that attending to the plank in our own eyes, looking at the problematic expressions of our own particular ideological preference, whichever side of the spectrum we sit. And if we do that, then that might just free us up to engage in dialogue with people that we disagree with, rather than shouting at them. One of the real dangers, I think, in our day is that we see people polarizing society, let's say around Islam. And we see a polarization opening up, and we see people using kind of them language, like we saw, I quoted you some earlier, they are doing this, they are conspiring, we should kick them out. And we say, my word, there's this big ditch opening up. How dare you polarize society? And what we end up doing is we end up speaking to the people who are promoting those opinions in exactly the same way. And we're protesting that they are polarizing society and digging a ditch there, and we are digging our own ditches here. Let's think hard about what it means to remove the plank from our own eyes and to worry more about the extreme and violent and divisive expressions of our own ideologies. Next slide, please. Along similar lines, really, but you will know that the beginning of John's Gospel describes Jesus as full of grace and truth. And I have reflected at times, for example, with the story of the Samaritan woman. What would it be like if she had met a man who was full of grace but not of truth? Or a man who was full of truth but not of grace? But thankfully, she met a man who was full of both. Job's friends, story of Job from the Old Testament, his friend's theology is not that cockeyed. It's pretty straight on, really. But they apply it like a brick. So let's be careful when we have deep convictions, which actually, quite honestly, we always need to be prepared to grow and learn and perhaps change. But let's assume for a minute, for the sake of argument, that we have this deep conviction and we're actually right. We still don't need to apply it like a brick. We need to operate with grace as well as truth. I'm coming into land, you'll be glad to know. I've got just 2 or 3 more. Next one, please. Jesus encourages us, doesn't he, to test people by their fruit. We've already referred to this with regard to the possible conversion of Tommy Robinson. But we need to test all of these movements by their fruit. The apostle tells us to test the spirits. And Jesus says to me, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Not everybody who claims the name of Jesus, not everybody who waves a banner or marches with a flag will enter the kingdom of heaven. And we need to be discerning, while acknowledging we can't see into hearts and souls, but we still need to exercise discernment. My final slide was substance, and then a little promo follows that. So my final slide was substance. Can I commend the ancient virtue of not overreacting? There was someone from the EA was interviewed a while ago. I'm not actually sure what the issue was he was interviewed about, but clearly the journalist wanted some kind of scandalized response, and he said, I'm not, I've forgotten the quotation now, bother. Something like, I'm not overly scandalized. It was a kind of very moderate response. And actually, I somebody who sometimes gets asked to do interviews and things, people really want to push you for a scandalized response. It was really interesting before the Tommy Robinson carol service that I gave a press statement saying kind of, well, we'll see, won't we, effectively. And then afterwards, and that was picked up and was quoted and used. Afterwards, I wrote this blog saying, well, I was surprised by what I saw. We'll have to watch and wait and respond with grace and optimism, but wisdom, you know. And nobody asked me to speak on the radio or anything about that. It's interesting, isn't it? So let's try and avoid overreacting. Let's not fall into the polarization trap. As I've said, let's not respond to one type of polarization by building our own ditch or digging our own ditches. Let's practice good listening and curiosity. Let's try and understand why people have the perspectives they have. We may or may not change their opinion or change our own opinion, but we will understand and love and respect people better. I want to recommend a book, actually, by a man called Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, which basically asks the question, why do good people differ on certain important issues? And I think he's not a Christian, he's a psychologist. Not that those two are incompatible, but he is one and not the other. But I think it's a really helpful exploration. And it helps me to understand why good people have different opinions from me. Also understanding that no one is good but God alone. Not everything we don't like is persecution. And that's really important to remember in this day. There is genuine Christian persecution going on across this world. And we actually debase that currency if we use that of trivial inconveniences or trivial limitations, which may or may not need to be disputed legally, but it's not persecution. Let's not deny what's evidently true, which is actually a temptation that I think movements on both sides of the political spectrum are tempted to do. And again, it's this kind of utilitarianism. If I see the goal, I know the goal is good, and I will bend and twist things a little bit just to try and make that goal happen. You know, this concept of triage, you know, a paramedic turns up with a horrible car accident, they'll go around trying to work out who's the sickest and who needs urgent care and who can wait. Theological triage is a really good thing to do. What are the primary things that we really need to get hot under the collar about? What are the things that we can dialogue about? What are the things we can simply agree to differ on? This event is put on by a group called Better Story. I've been also speaking about a better story. We have a thicker story. We have a thicker theology. We have a better story. We don't need to make up a new story. We don't need to politicize the gospel. We don't need to respond to one politicization of the gospel by offering a counter-politicization of the gospel. Let's have confidence in the ancient story, which saved the Apostle Paul, which saved Aquinas, which saved Augustine, saved Luther, it saved Spurgeon and Wesley, it saved us. The gospel is powerful, it has legs, we can have confidence in it. And finally, I'll just tell you about a book I have published and one that is coming up, which might be of interest. So when I started to study these movements, this is really when we were in the kind of far-right territory rather than the Christian nationalism territory. I led a consultation, and out of that consultation came a collection of edited papers, which is the Purple Book. And in the conclusion to that, I offer 10 recommendations to the British Church of how the British Church might respond to the use of Christian symbolism by these movements. I've actually got 2 copies with me, and I've also got, you're welcome to take a little kind of card with those 10 recommendations on it. Help yourself to that, and don't help yourself to a book without handing me some money though, please. Coming up, the book on the right, Faithful Presence in a Fractured World. This is a more accessible, it's a toolkit for people in pastoral ministry or Christians in general who want to make a difference, but also have other things on their plate. Most church ministers do not have 35 hours a week to give to this issue because they have other things to be doing, but also can be really concerned. So some kind of suggestions and ideas, but also leaning into the idea that the quiet work of loving our neighbours, the quiet work of building social cohesion, the quiet work of serving our communities, the quiet work of preaching the gospel, this is what we need to be doing. We are already doing it. Let's have confidence. Let's respond with faith and integrity and courage in this time, but let's not panic because Christ is on the throne.